This might seem like a weird swerve from my last video, mainly because it is, sort of. But I love music and technology equally, and this channel isn't about me being good or showing off, it's about watching me learn and suffer. So come along with me on this journey to get an operational C graphics library on my computer. How hard could it be? I decided on the GTK graphics library mainly because A, it was free and I am a college student, B, several highly acclaimed apps were made using the library, and C, it's known for having a lot of documentation, so if and when I get lost, I won't be on my own. Apart from that, I had several hurdles to cross. First off, I need to get an actual C compiler on my computer, which I know does not sound like me starting at the starting line, but me starting asleep in my bed several miles away from the starting line. But trust me, that wasn't the case. Java was my main programming language for a long time, and I used to exclusively program in an Oracle Eclipse environment. However, I have plenty of experience with C programming on other machines, just not my personal machine. I'm taking several tries regardless. The first GCC compiler I went to use was the CWig compiler. This worked great. Worked exactly how I was expecting it to immediately upon download and was super easy to use. I made my project files within the environment. I compiled quickly. I then proceeded to use the package manager to install the GTK3 deval package. Then proceeded to run the test code and... Oops! The library isn't recognized! Okay. Let's try downloading all the GTK packages. Library still isn't recognized. Oh! Okay, perfect. It was at this point that I went to a professor who tried to help me, but he couldn't figure it out either. We ultimately discussed, and it was determined that while CWig was great, it was ultimately an isolated Linux environment that can't really impact the rest of my computer, much less spit out an exe file, which is ultimately what I was aiming for, so I had to find another compiler. So instead I went to Visual Studio Code. I went to install Visual Studio Code to find I already had it installed from another project. I just hadn't used it in a while. Put a pin in that. We'll be coming back to that. Either way, boot open Visual Studio Code, I download the C++ code editor. Immediately remember that the code editors don't actually come with compilers. Okay, let me just download MIGWig64 quickly, follow a quick tutorial, and oh, my command line still isn't recognizing that I have a GCC compiler. What happened now? After 20-ish minutes of digging, I found that I had put the path in the user variables and not the system variables, and finally, I had a working GCC compiler on my local machine. Also, remember this edit variable screen. It will be very important later. Little did I know, this was the easy part. I then proceeded to go back to the GTK website to research the best way to install it in VS Code, which ultimately led me to the GVS build GitHub. This is where I have to admit something else. I've never been able to successfully compile source code from GitHub before, which yes, I know is a problem, and believe me, it was not from a lack of trying. But there's no turning back now! The first couple of steps went surprisingly smoothly. Downloaded the Chocolatey package manager, installed MSYS2, a version of the GTK compiler environment, reinstalled Visual Studio 2022 just to be sure I had the right version. Had to download the latest version of Python, because of course. Installed GVS build, had a slight problem for some reason, but the command ran without error the second time, so who knows what happened. Finally, I built GTK4 in my PowerShell. I followed the instructions step by step, listed on the GitHub. Surely this is idiot-proof. I added the path to the system variables. Put another pin here. This is another thing we're gonna have to come back to. The final step is where all hell broke loose. This is where they were finally connecting GTK and Visual Studios. The first part of the step told me to open Visual Studio and create a new project. Stop. I reopened Visual Studio Code several times. I dug through every menu. I finally started Googling. Google told me the same thing. Just open VS Code and it should pop right open. I finally started Googling widgets, and upon Googling Solution Explorer widget, I realized I had the wrong version of Visual Studio Code downloaded. I had Visual Studio Tools 2022 downloaded. I needed Visual Studio IED, which is called Visual Studio Community 2022. Okay, this is okay. I still had the VS Code installer installed. I quickly downloaded it. I finished up the rest of the steps, and the test code fails to build. Great. I am utterly stuck at this point. I went down to the troubleshooting section. I was confused of what it meant by using the dash clean or the dash from scratch, which I have no excuse for. I have tons of experience in command line. The fact that I didn't realize those were command line modifiers is totally on me. Just cut me some slack. It was 11 p.m. on a Sunday, and I had spent the whole afternoon on this. Either way, the next day I looked at it with fresh eyes. The first thing I tried was building GTK3 in case there was any sort of bugs within GTK4. That did not help. Still getting the same build error. Okay, I finally realized that I remembered what the troubleshooting ideas were and rebuilt GTK4 using the dash from scratch and dash clean modifiers. Build was still failing. By this point, I started writing this script to have some outlet for my frustration short of throwing my laptop out a window, and was rereading through the instructions on the GitHub page to trace back my steps. In doing so, I noticed a little tidbit. In the instructions of how to add GTK to the environment variables, it's said to put the path and the location in the top set of variables. I don't know if you know this, but the top set of variables are the user variables, not the system variables. I rejoiced. The solution to my problem had been found. I changed the variable path, I redid the linkers, and the build still failed. Here is where I start attempting to install the SDL2 library instead. SDL2 is another powerful graphics library with plenty of documentation to follow. It'll be fine. It'll be totally fine. I pull up the first tutorial. It's great, but due to the Wi-Fi where I was, the quality of the video was too low for me to see the inputs he was sending to the command line, so I pull up another one. I go to the .tar file, and the website has been updated. The download links have been moved to GitHub. Download the file from GitHub that I thought was the right one. Wrong file. Whoops! Downloaded the right one, extracted it, all the folders match, put all the files in the correct place, attempt to use the makefile, and the makefile isn't compiling. Fine, just copy and paste the command into the command line and run it. And none of the library functions are being recognized. Not even the library call. I did some more testing. I tried running the C++ program without any library add-ons, and my VS Code wasn't even letting me compile C++, which, why? MIGWED comes with a built-in C and C++ compiler. My command line spits back out what version of the G++ compiler I have. It kept spitting out that either the library was not recognized or an unidentified reference to WinMain@16, which I wish I knew what that meant. At this point, I just decided to dump the whole SDL2 source code into my VS Code project. The library still wasn't found. This is fine. So I go out and find an SDL installation tutorial specifically from the year 2022. This shows exactly which GitHub file to download. Going back to the second version of VS Code, I mapped the libraries to the correct places, and finally, the library was recognized. I rejoice! I ran the code! Just to have the program crash because it couldn't find SDL2.dil. How could it not find the file? I linked the folder where it's the top file. I even copied and pasted it into the resource files. What is happening? Well, I am pleased to announce I found the solution by finishing the tutorial. Do you remember our old friend, edit the system environment variable? They come back with a vengeance. After watching the rest of the video and adding the new variable, I ran the code and it spit out a successful window! I had done it! I wept tears of triumph as the journey that should have taken me an hour and have not even been a journey had come to an end. And I stood at that end, triumphant.